Have you ever left a conversation feeling unsettled, even though nothing bad actually happened? No yelling, no insults, no obvious attack, but something in you just felt like it shifted, or even felt a bit unsettled? If you have, then you felt exactly what I want to explore today: the subtle, almost invisible ways that covert narcissism can land on you. We're going to think about why this matters, especially in relationships where the dynamics are long standing, like between a parent and a child, and now an adult child. This feeling it leaves you with is exactly what we see in the stories that I want to share with you today. On the surface, it looks harmless, but under the hood, the relational dynamics and the impact that it has on you are quietly very powerful. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Before we get into today's example, I want to briefly orient you, especially if you're new to this podcast. In earlier episodes, we've spent time unpacking covert narcissism, particularly what it's like to grow up with a covertly narcissistic parent. And one of the cautions that I emphasized is that common advice, things like setting firm boundaries or keeping conversations short, often falls flat in these dynamics. Instead, we focused on understanding the structure of covert narcissism, with a particular focus on their sensitivity to feedback, which is experienced as criticism, how they are masters at inducing guilt and shame when you assert any level of independence. Emotional withdrawal is another attribute that they use. Victim mentality, when you're framed as attacking or hurting them simply by naming how their behavior leaves you feeling. They also are envious of your success, and that quiet, disorganizing emotional detachment, that subtle pulling away that happens when you've done something that they experience as exposing their inadequacy, such as sharing good news that isn't about them, making a decision without consulting them, or calmly saying you were hurt by something that they did, and then watching them suddenly go cold. Again, those are all of the things that we looked at in prior episodes on covert narcissistic parenting, or just covert narcissism in general. So I'm not going to revisit all of that today. What I want to do instead is slow things down and look closely at a single interaction between a parent and a child, because this is where these dynamics actually start, often so quietly and subtle that they go unnoticed, yet they end up organizing you and how you come to understand yourself and your worth in relationships. These aren't dramatic blow-ups. They're small, ordinary moments, interactions that seem insignificant on the surface, but leave you feeling subtly off balance afterwards. I want to give you a prototypical example from my practice. A daughter is talking with her mother about something vulnerable, her struggle with acne. Nothing dramatic, no conflict, just an everyday conversation that most people would register as neutral. The mother makes an offhand comment, attributing the patient's problem to genetics, specifically to the father. It lands quietly and then passes just as quickly. No raised voice, no insults, no obvious edge on any of this. And yet, something shifts inside the daughter. She feels activated, slightly unsettled, a familiar tightening that she feels in her body, but she can't quite name why. There's a pause, not because she's thinking deeply, but because her system is already trying to make sense of something that has not been spoken aloud. Almost immediately, the mother moves on. But when she notices the silence, she clarifies that she didn't mean anything by it. That's just a fact. Genetics. Again, a seemingly neutral comment, right? On the surface, that's true. There's no attack here, nothing to argue with, nothing to repair. But the impact doesn't disappear. It just goes underground. When the daughter later tries to name the feeling, when she tentatively says that the comment didn't feel good, she's met with something familiar. The concern is dismissed. She's told she's, and I'm quoting, too sensitive, and that no one was criticizing anyone, that, and again I quote, she's reading into things. And now she's holding two things at once. One, the sting of the original comment that her mother made, and two, it's the accusation that she is the problem for feeling too strongly. And this is a bind. There's an impact, but there's no obvious offender. And because there's no clear offense, the daughter is left alone with the discomfort, forced to metabolize it internally, usually through self-doubt. So in fact, you could see it doesn't get metabolized at all. It kind of just sits inside of her. Manifestly, the mother's comment is factual. Again, a neutral observation. But latently, that's below the surface, it does something else. It organizes the problem as belonging to someone else, someone already charged in the mother's internal world. In many divorced families, one parent, in this case the father, carries the residue of unresolved disappointment or resentment. He becomes the container for what's flawed, undesirable, or again I quote, bad, making it difficult for the child to long for him or even hold him in mind without feeling conflicted or wrong. So the reaction from the daughter has nothing to do with genetics. She's reacting to the relational meaning of the observation. She feels the familiar pull to align with the mother by quietly accepting the implication or to risk disconnecting if she questions her mother. And over time, this is how confusion becomes safer than clarity. So here's the question I encourage you to sit with for a moment. What happens to a child when their vulnerability, such as turning to their mother to talk about acne, or in other cases, trying to speak about the pain of an absent father, is met not with emotional presence, but with coldness, emotional disconnection, and even blame? And I quote, "You were never close to your father. I don't know why you miss him so much." If this is resonating with you, you know that you don't just feel unheard. You begin to learn quietly over time that your needs are burdensome. Your longings feel disloyal to your parent, and your vulnerability becomes something that has to be managed, hidden, or reshaped in order to preserve the relationship with your parent. So what's actually happening here beneath the surface, psychodynamically, when a parent responds this way? What's going on? That's what we need to think about next.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. In psychodynamic terms, what the mother is doing here isn't neutral at all. The comment works to move anxiety away from herself. The discomfort doesn't stay in the relational space. It gets displaced outward. The cause of the problem is located somewhere else, in someone else. And in doing that, the covert narcissistic mother preserves a very specific self-image. Reasonable, uninvolved, but innocent. She isn't implicated. She's simply observing, explaining, naming the facts. But beneath that reasonableness is something else. There's a quiet deflection of responsibility. In other words, this isn't about me. A subtle assignment of blame. In other words, this comes from him. Or this is your problem. This is your fault. And an emotional withdrawal that feels rational on the surface, but leaves you alone with, again, I quote, with bad feelings. Most importantly, the mother doesn't simply position herself outside the daughter's vulnerability, she intensifies it. By refusing emotional contact while subtly redirecting blame, the daughter is left not only without comfort, but with more to manage. What more does she have to manage now? Confusion, self-doubt, and the sense that her feelings are somehow wrong or dangerous. And in a covert narcissistic dynamic, this is crucial. The mother cannot tolerate being emotionally implicated. She cannot tolerate being needed in a way that doesn't center her. Remember, this initially was about the daughter's acne. What becomes unbearable are moments when the child's longings point elsewhere. When a son falls in love and begins to orient around another woman. When a daughter wants to think about or maintain a relationship with her father. Or when something like acne stirs the mother's own unworked feelings of defectiveness or shame. In other words, these are unresolved feelings in the mother that she then needs to get rid of. And in each of these cases, these examples that I'm throwing out, because there are so many of them, but in each of them, the child's vulnerability activates something the mother cannot hold in herself. And so it must be redirected, minimized, or quietly pushed away. Stated differently, she cannot stay present with feelings that might generate guilt, responsibility, or mutual emotionality. That's the connectedness that I mentioned earlier that she pushes away. This acne comes from your father. You can almost hear it as you listen closely, that it's a deflection of responsibility. Not me, nothing's wrong with me. There's covert blame assignment. This comes from him. And an implicit assumption. Something is wrong with him, and therefore something is wrong with you. But not me, of course. But here's the real tragedy. You're absorbing this pattern, not as a single moment, but if this occurs over many years, over time, it becomes a way of organizing your inner world. That's what I mentioned earlier, that it begins to wear away on your own reality testing, on your own self-worth. But over time, I help her notice a familiar dynamic. Her mother routinely points to the father as the source of the problems, even in small, everyday situations, like disagreements between the two of them. And it's always framed in a way that seems harmless, but carries a hidden, critical undertone. Part of the work is helping her become more aware of these relational patterns. One in which her mother consistently locates the source of difficulties in the father, often through seemingly minor or, and I quote, innocent observations, like, for example, equating everyday problems with him, such as his acne problem. I'm wondering if you have ever been in this kind of position. You know that you feel affected, but if you express it, you're told that you're overreacting, or it's dismissed as nothing. That's the double bind that I'm trying to get at here. And that's what makes these dynamics so confusing. This combination, criticism followed by disavowal, creates the double bind. She, the daughter, is exposed to chronic criticism while simultaneously being asked to experience it as harmless. Over time, this undermines her capacity to trust her own perceptions and emotional reactions. Gradually, this confusion seeps into other areas of her life. Difficulty holding others accountable without feeling guilt. Uncertainty about one's own agency. As you may remember with the man who told his mother that he found a new love and he was criticized. This was, he shared with her that he found a new love and was thinking about getting engaged, but he was criticized about his inability to have an effective relationship and a persistent tendency to second guess your own emotional reality. And again, just to stay with this example with this man that I just mentioned, he begins to wonder, is it true what my mother is saying? Do I really always have a hard time maintaining relationships? What happens next doesn't simply emerge on its own. Through repeated attention in the therapeutic space, what was once taken in to the daughter automatically from her mother becomes something she begins to observe, question, and hold at a distance. Over time, she begins to notice a shift from unconsciously absorbing the mother's covert blaming, criticizing, and shaming to pausing, reflecting on it, and eventually recognizing it as something that belongs to her mother, not to her. In small bits and pieces, she no longer experiences herself as defective, as carrying a flaw that she alone has to fix. Like many of the patients who grow up with a covert, narcissistically oriented parent, she learned to hide parts of herself, her need for reassurance, her disappointment, her wish to be comforted, because those needs were experienced, and I quote, as too much. What changes in the work is that she begins to notice when she's editing herself and slowly allows those needs to exist without immediately shaming or erasing them. Another common example comes from a man who, much like this daughter that I'm describing, was becoming increasingly aware of his mother's critical engagement with him and emotional coldness around any move towards independence. When he told his mother, again, this is what I was just mentioning a moment ago, that he was getting engaged, she responded with a flat, cold, distant, and I quote, okay. Could you imagine telling your mother or any parent such a life-moving event that you're getting engaged and you're met with, okay? At that moment, he felt, understandably, a wave of disappointment, but also a strange sense of validation, because in his mind, it confirmed something we had been working toward in the treatment. It suddenly clarified the guilt he had carried with him for years, the feeling that he was doing something wrong. He can now see that getting engaged wasn't, again, I quote, bad or selfish, his words, but really intense feelings that he carried with him everywhere he went. It was simply something his mother could not tolerate because it represented separation from her. So in other words, if that wasn't clear, what I'm trying to capture here is that this man felt validated because already we had been working on him thinking about his mother's cold, distant responses to any good news in his life. So now what he begins to see and feel is a sense of validation because this is something that his mother cannot tolerate. It's not something inherently bad that he's doing. What's striking is how the sense of being, and I quote, too much showed up next. He told me that he had written me an email describing what happened with his mother, how validated he felt, and how for the first time he wasn't overwhelmed by guilt, but he couldn't send it to me. As we came to understand, he felt he would be troubling me, burdening me, intruding by reaching out between sessions, as though his relief and need to share were already one step too far. In other words, I would get upset with him. With this man and the daughter, even though the conversation remained outwardly neutral, for both of them, the body registered the shift first, right? So something went on inside of both of them. She described it, and I quote, as her engine started to run. Crucially, and quite confusingly, no overt attack occurred. The impact was indirect, subtle, and plausibly deniable. The mother's comment carried an implicit critical meaning while remaining innocuous on the surface. As a result, the patient was left with a strong internal reaction, but no clear external reference point to attach it to. With this kind of confusion, meaning collapses. Anger and aggression is never processed or even acknowledged as anger. And we have to say more about that in part 2 of the series, by the way. When I explored an almost identical relational dynamic with another patient, she said with clear frustration that she had explicitly told her mother that any discussion involving her father was, and I quote, a no-go. She knew it would upset her. She had named the boundary clearly and directly, and yet her mother continued to locate blame there anyway. Another reason that boundaries are not always effective. What's striking isn't the boundary violation itself. It's what the patient has to do internally to survive it. See, that's much more effective than just setting a boundary. What has to happen internally to survive these covert attacks? I think that all of these examples show how repeated criticism and exposure to that trains the psyche to doubt its own signals. If left unmetabolized, unprocessed, and unspoken, what develops is a chronic insecurity, erosion of self-esteem and reality testing, and a persistent self-questioning rather than thought, language, or even protest. Over time, the question stops being, why does this hurt? And becomes, am I wrong for being hurt at all? As the work deepens, something important shifts. Not in the mother's behavior, because this is not about the mother, believe it or not. Something shifts in how all of these patients begin to organize its meaning. What I'm trying to demonstrate is that as the therapeutic work deepens, there comes a moment in treatment when the feelings finally begin to make sense. The confusion starts to loosen, not because the mother changes, but because the daughter no longer has to erase herself or disown her emotional reality in order to stay attached. Early in the work, it's important to help each of these patients recognize what their mother was communicating, and just as importantly, what she was not communicating. That recognition helped organize the confusion. And this is what we call mentalization. I spoke about this in a prior episode with Gordon, something that you may want to check out. But that's the capacity to think about somebody else's thoughts, feelings, and motivations. So early in the work, I have to help all of these patients increase their capacity for mentalization and recognize what their mother is doing. But at a certain point, staying focused on the mother stops being therapeutic. We're not here just to blame the mother and say that the daughter or that fellow that I mentioned earlier is, and I quote, the victim of covert narcissism. That's not the point. The work has to turn inward to the daughter's, for instance, relationship with her own experience. The focus now becomes helping the daughter stay with her own internal reactions without immediately disqualifying them. We begin by slowing the moment down. When she notices that familiar activation, that tightening, that urge to go quiet, that inner engine that I mentioned earlier that starts running, we treat it not as a problem, but as information. It's a signal that something just occurred. Over time, she learns to name the feelings. We name the affect before it collapses into self-criticism. Hurt, sadness, longing, and anger. Not all at once. These things again merge, remember I said earlier, in bits and pieces, often one feeling at a time. Gradually, the internalized maternal voice, don't make this a problem, don't need, don't react, loses some of its authority. It becomes recognizable as a voice she learned, not a truth about who she is. Big difference there. And perhaps most importantly, If I can return briefly to the fellow who recognized his mother's cold response to the news that he got engaged and wrote me an email that he did not send, most importantly, he begins to experience something new in the therapeutic relationship itself, that his vulnerability doesn't need to lead to withdrawal, that needing doesn't result in distance. Remember, he got this from his mother with the cold okay around a separation. He's getting engaged. That is a separation. But anyway, that needing doesn't result in distance, that he can safely reach out to me without feeling like a burden, that he is, and I quote, too much. Those feelings can be met, held, and thought about together. And this is where I want to pause for today. Because what we've been tracing here isn't just difficult relationship. It's the quiet way a person learns to mistrust their own emotional reality and then slowly begins to reclaim it. We followed how confusion forms, how affect goes disowned, and how the work shifts from trying to understand the mother to helping you, or someone you may know, stay with your own experience without erasing yourself to stay attached. But this isn't the end of the story. What we haven't yet talked about is what happens next. What changes when, for example, this daughter brings that emerging self into her adult relationships, how anger shows up, and how frightening that can feel. All of that is for the next episode. So please stay tuned for that. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.